Thank you, Mr. Hollebone. Like others, I'm a little surprised at the level of attendance at this afternoon's debate. I can never tell with these things whether that's a lack of empathy across the House for the sentiments behind the petition or whether it's just that the Attorney-General is bigger box office than this discussion. But we are where we are. The way I see it is this. I don't think in a free, open and democratic society you can say that people don't have the right to change their minds. Of course they do. A group of people voting in a referendum one day in history cannot forever bind people for the future. Therefore, I think any of us would be in very thin ice if we were to get into a situation of saying you can never have a second referendum on this question. On the other hand, I think we have to accept that with big questions of governance and constitutional politics, you can't go changing your mind every day, or even every month, or even every year. So therefore, the way I see it is that we have to ask ourselves, in what circumstances is it legitimate to consider a second referendum, a so-called people's vote? And I think there are three tests that need to be applied before the legitimacy test is passed. The first is that it needs to be demonstrated that the information on which people made their original decision is in some way compromised, either because it was wrong or because it is now obsolete and has been superseded by further developments. And I don't think, with regard to the Brexit referendum, anyone can argue other than that the information on which people based their decision was fatally flawed. And in response to the honourable gentleman's statement, I'm not one of those who blame the electorate. I don't say that people were stupid or didn't understand the question. I say that they were deliberately misled by people. I say they were given information which was false, and deliberately so. And in many ways there was a level of mendacity in that campaign that was on an industrial scale. And that's why people were conned in June 2016 in many ways to making the decision that they did. And now we have an awful lot more information about what is at stake and what the consequences are. And therefore, we move on to the second test, which is this. Have a significant number of people change their minds on the question? And by significant, I mean enough to produce a different result where the question put again. And I think, again, on that test, it is met. It is clear from opinion polls consistently now over 3 or 4 months, the latest one even only today, that a large number of people have changed their mind on the question, sufficient to produce a different result where the question put again. And the Prime Minister is very fond, and the government is very fond of saying that 17.4 million people voted to leave the EU, the biggest number in our history that have ever voted for anything, and that's true. But here's the inconvenient truth. At least 2 million of them have now changed their minds. And I think it is being disrespectful to those people not at least to consider whether or not the circumstances are such that they should be consulted again. And the third of the three tests, I would say, is this, that the Parliament, the legislator charged with discharging the mandate from the referendum, is either unwilling or incapable of doing so. Now, we're not at that point yet. But next Tuesday evening, and I think I have no reason to change my view from the speeches so far today, next Tuesday evening, I'm fairly certain that the Parliament will reject the withdrawal agreement that has been put before it by the government. And in those circumstances, we will be entering a period of unknown chaos, where the Parliament may well be incapable of making any decision. And this political gridlock, this stasis, perhaps can only be resolved by putting the question back to the people who started the process in the first place, and that is all of the citizens of the country. Now, I say, therefore, that a people's vote shouldn't be regarded as something which is there as an alternative way of agreeing the withdrawal deal. It's actually going to happen, if it does, as a consequence of the failure of the Parliament and the government to be able to and prepare a withdrawal deal. Now, I speak for the SNP, for the third party in the United Kingdom Parliament, so it would be remiss of me not to try and give some sort of perspective from north of the border. Scotland, as colleagues know, took a different view to the rest of Britain.
Well, the honourable gentleman, good one.
Quite happy to.
I'm grateful. I'm following, but don't agree with many of the points that he's making. But on the final point he was making, that there is a failure of Parliament, is it not primarily a failure of the government? And if a government fails, shouldn't the government go back to the electorate?
The honourable gentleman predicts my next point, which is let me first of all just say something about the situation in Scotland, where 62% of the people voted to remain in the European Union. And by all polling evidence, if that decision were asked again, it would be more like 68 to 70%. So, I mean, the opinion is quite different in Scotland than it is in England and in Wales. But it's interesting, I think, the attitude of the SNP-led, the minority SNP government in Scotland, when faced with a situation as to what to do with this result, that Scotland had voted one way and the rest of the United Kingdom had voted another way. We had tried, as colleagues will remember, in the debate on the referendum bill, to try and get some provisions in the bill itself that would recognise the different nations within the United Kingdom, but we failed in that endeavour. And the Scottish Government didn't say, oh, well, we don't recognise the result in the UK because we're against Brexit and this is the Scottish position. Quite the contrary. A government which believed in and aspired to an independent Scotland and membership of the European Union produced a detailed document which advocated neither of those things. Scotland's Place in Europe, which was published in December 2016, was a detailed and comprehensive policy analysis of how Brexit could take place, but in a way which would not have the effects on the Scottish economy and would better respect public opinion in Scotland. And we were basically arguing, we still argue to this day, as a compromise for what has become known as a Norway Plus position, where we actually aim to stay in the single market and the customs union. Now, we haven't yet been successful in that endeavour, but it is interesting that for 24 months, the Scottish Government has been trying to offer this compromise and to get a discussion going about it, and for 24 months has effectively been ignored, which brings me to the point about how the Government has actually managed this process. Because here we are 30 months after the original referendum result, a result which was, by any observation, a narrow one, a divided one, clearly the country very split. And a better government, in my view, would have taken that result and would have tried to steer a course which respected the majority of public opinion, to leave the European Union, to no longer formally be a member of it, but to recognise also that almost half the country did value their European citizenship, and to try and find some compromise that would allow Brexit to take place, but in a way which minimised the depression of their European identity. But the government didn't do that. Not at all. The government took an absolute position and said, this is clear-cut, it's black and white, the 52% won, the 42% we are now no longer going to talk about. They were written out of history as if their opinions did not matter. And that is one of the things that has caused so much resentment, so much anger, and which is now fueling this demand for a people's vote. And in fact, it's even worse than that, because what happened was that the 52% were disrespected as well. And you had every sort of right-wing cause in the country trying to tack their ideas onto the 52% as if that was a mandate for what they wanted. So many people in the 52% were represented as well, were misrepresented. So I say that if you had had a government which could have been more inclusive in its approach and actually had a dialogue with people, with opposition parties, with local government, with the national governments and the devolved legislatures, we might be in a slightly better position. We might actually have had more of a consensual approach that could possibly command support on the floor of the House next Tuesday. But we are what we are. We don't have that. And we have a Prime Minister who, Canute-like, seems to be just ignoring wave after wave of concern and opposition that is expressed. Now, we will spend over the next 5 days a lot of time talking about the detail of these 585 pages and the 24-page framework document. So I don't want to go into that here. But it is calamitous, in my view, that the government has got itself into this position, and it didn't need to happen. And if it could, even at this 11th hour, pull back and understand that by setting the impossible red lines in the first place, it put itself on a course to always deliver a product which was never going to command support in the House, and worse, doesn't really seem to satisfy anyone in the country, never mind the 52% who voted on June 2016. So the government, in many ways, has to think again, and it seems to me that actually, once we get past next Tuesday, the opportunity for the people to vote again on this question may provide the government with its lifeline to try and get out of the mess which it has created for itself. If it doesn't do that, then I certainly agree the time has come for this government to get out of the road and be replaced with a government that is going to do a better job.
Thank you very much, Mr. Holloway, and as